In the autumn of 1945, a converted hospital ship named the USS Comfort cut through the grey waters of the Atlantic, carrying an unusual cargo: 487 German women, prisoners of war from the disbanded Wehrmacht auxiliary services. Among them was Oberhelferin Greta Hoffman, a 28-year-old communications specialist from Hamburg, whose hollow cheeks and worn uniform told the story of Germany's final, desperate months. In her coat pocket, she clutched a photograph of her two young daughters, their faces thin and pale in the picture taken just before her deployment. Scrawled on the back in pencil were the words, "Mutti, we are so hungry." Like her fellow prisoners, Greta had survived the collapse of the Third Reich on watery soup made from nettles, bread stretched with sawdust, and the gnawing, constant ache of starvation. The women had been trained as radio operators, telephone switchboard workers, searchlight crews, and clerical staff, roles that kept the Wehrmacht functioning even as the regime crumbled. They had eaten less than soldiers, less than male prisoners, and far less than their families back home, who were reduced to boiling tree bark and hunting for rats in the rubble of bombed cities. As the ship approached New York Harbor, Greta stood on deck with her comrades, bracing for what they assumed would be harsh treatment. They had heard whispers of Allied prison camps, rumors filtered through propaganda and fear. Some women wept quietly, certain they would be separated, interrogated, perhaps punished for their service to a regime now universally condemned. Others, like Lieutenant Elsa Braun, a former schoolteacher from Munich who had coordinated anti-aircraft communications, remained stoic, her jaw set in defiance even as her stomach cramped with hunger. What they encountered instead would shatter every belief they held about their enemies. The transformation began before they even reached American soil. Aboard the USS Comfort, the women were processed with a bureaucratic efficiency that stunned them. American Navy personnel, including female nurses from the WAVES, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, treated them not as criminals but as human beings requiring care. They were given medical examinations, clean clothing, and something none of them expected: hot showers with real soap that lathered and smelled of lavender. But it was the food that broke them. The first meal served in the ship's mess hall was breakfast: scrambled eggs, thick slices of bacon, buttered toast made from soft white bread, fresh oranges, and coffee. Actual coffee. Not the bitter roasted grain ersatz they had choked down for years. The women sat in stunned silence as Navy stewards, their uniforms crisp and faces neutral, placed the trays before them. Many stared at the food as if it were a mirage, afraid to touch it. Greta Hoffman's hands trembled as she picked up her fork. The eggs were fluffy and rich with butter, the bacon crisp and salty, the bread so soft it seemed to melt on her tongue. She took one bite, then another. And then the tears came, hot, uncontrollable sobs that racked her thin frame. Around her, other women wept openly, some covering their faces with their hands, others clutching their forks like lifelines. "I haven't eaten like this in years," Greta whispered to the woman beside her, Helferin Anna Schmidt, a radar operator from Berlin. "Not since before the war." Anna, who had been 17 when the war started and knew nothing of peacetime abundance, simply stared at her plate, tears streaming down her face. "Is this real?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Is this really happening?" A Navy nurse, Lieutenant Mary O'Brien from Boston, approached their table, her expression gentle but professional. "Eat slowly," she advised in careful German. "Your stomachs aren't used to rich food. There's more if you want it, but pace yourselves." The idea that there was more, that this wasn't a one-time gesture, but the beginning of regular meals, seemed impossible. The women had been conditioned to hoard every crumb, to eat quickly before someone could take their rations. Now they were being told to eat slowly, to take their time, because there would be more tomorrow. Oberhelferin Marlene Kessler, a telephone operator from Stuttgart who had spent the final months of the war in a bunker surviving on 400 calories a day, wrote in a letter smuggled through the Red Cross, "They gave us oranges, real oranges. I held mine for 10 minutes before I could bring myself to peel it." In Germany, an orange was something you dreamed about, a memory from childhood. Here they gave us two each, and when one woman couldn't finish hers, they didn't take it away. They let her keep it. I cried so hard I couldn't eat for an hour. The women had been raised on Nazi propaganda that painted Americans as weak, decadent, their society collapsing under the weight of racial mixing and moral decay. They had been told that America's industrial might was exaggerated, that the country couldn't possibly sustain a war effort while maintaining civilian comfort. Yet here was the evidence, undeniable and overwhelming, served 3 times a day on metal trays. Lunch brought sandwiches, thick ham and cheese on fresh rye bread, with crisp lettuce, juicy tomatoes, and creamy mayonnaise. There were apples, shiny and red, and cookies, soft chocolate chip cookies still warm from the oven. Dinner was roast chicken with gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, and for dessert, vanilla ice cream. The women, many of whom hadn't seen ice cream since 1939, sat in stunned silence as the cold, sweet cream melted on their tongues. Some laughed through their tears, the absurdity of their situation, eating ice cream as prisoners of war, too much to process. Helferin Brigitte Werner, a 22-year-old from Dresden who had operated searchlights during air raids, wrote in her diary, "They served us ice cream. Ice cream. In Germany, children are dying of starvation, and here we are, enemies, prisoners, eating ice cream like it's nothing. I don't understand this country. I don't understand how they can have so much." The voyage across the Atlantic took 8 days, and with each passing day the women's disbelief deepened. The meals never diminished in quality or quantity. Breakfast always included eggs, meat, bread, and fruit. Lunch and dinner brought variety: meatloaf, pork chops, fried fish, each meal accompanied by vegetables, milk, and dessert. The Navy crew ate the same food, sitting at nearby tables, their casual conversation and laughter, a stark contrast to the somber silence of the German women. The prisoners began to notice other details that challenged their indoctrination. The American sailors, both men and women, worked together with an easy camaraderie that would have been unthinkable in the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht. The waves, women in their 20s and 30s, held ranks, gave orders, and were treated with the same respect as their male counterparts. Elsa Braun, who had been taught that women belonged in the home, serving the Reich through motherhood and domestic duty, watched in fascination as a female lieutenant commanded a team of sailors with quiet authority. In Germany, we were told that women in military roles were a sign of desperation, of a society that had lost its way, Elsa wrote in a letter to her sister. But these American women are confident, capable. They don't apologize for their presence. They belong here, and everyone knows it. The ship docked in Norfolk, Virginia, and the women were transferred to trains bound for internment camps scattered across the American South and Midwest. Like their male counterparts, they expected cramped cattle cars and harsh conditions. Instead, they found themselves in passenger coaches with cushioned seats, large windows, and, to their astonishment, dining cars. As the train rolled through the Virginia countryside, past farms bursting with crops and small towns glowing with electric lights, the women pressed their faces to the windows, trying to reconcile what they saw with what they had been told. Greta Hoffman stared at a roadside market piled high with pumpkins, apples, and corn. A group of children played nearby, eating candy bars and drinking Coca-Cola, tossing the wrappers into a trash bin without a second thought. "Look at the waste," murmured Anna Schmidt. But there was no anger in her voice, only confusion. How can they afford to throw anything away? In the dining car, the women were served meals that rivaled those on the ship. Breakfast of pancakes with maple syrup, sausage, and fresh milk. Lunch of grilled cheese sandwiches, tomato soup, and sliced peaches. Dinner of roast beef, baked potatoes, and warm rolls with butter. The portions were generous, the food hot and fresh, and once again, the women wept. Marlene Kessler wrote, "We passed through a town called Raleigh. There was a bakery with a window full of cakes, pies, and pastries. A woman came out with a tray of fresh bread and set it on a table outside. People bought loaves, smiling and chatting, like it was the most normal thing in the world. In Germany, people would have rioted for that bread. Here it's just another Tuesday." The trains delivered the women to camps in Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, facilities hastily converted from former CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps sites, or newly constructed barracks. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, but the conditions inside were far from oppressive. The women were housed in clean barracks with cots, mattresses, blankets, and electric lights. There were flush toilets, hot showers, and even small libraries stocked with German-language books. But it was the mess halls that delivered the most profound shock. At Camp Swift in Texas, where Greta Hoffman and 300 other women were interned, the first dinner was a feast that seemed designed to mock their suffering. Fried chicken, golden and crispy, mashed potatoes with rich gravy, corn on the cob dripping with butter, biscuits so light they seemed to float, and for dessert, apple pie with vanilla ice cream. The women stood in line, their eyes wide, their hands shaking as they received their trays. When they sat down to eat, the tears began again, this time accompanied by quiet, desperate laughter. "This is a dream," Anna Schmidt said, her voice breaking. "We'll wake up, and it will all be gone." But it wasn't a dream. The meals continued, day after day, week after week. Breakfast of scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. Lunch of hamburgers, French fries, and coleslaw. Dinner of pot roast, carrots, peas, and chocolate cake. The women received 3,200 calories a day, more than they had eaten in years, more than their families in Germany could imagine. The scale of the food was staggering. Each camp's kitchen was a marvel of American efficiency, equipped with gas ranges, walk-in refrigerators, industrial mixers and ovens that could feed hundreds with assembly line precision. Helferin Ingrid Müller, a former secretary from Berlin assigned to kitchen duty, was astounded by the operation. "We threw away leftovers," she wrote in her diary. "Perfectly good meat, bread, vegetables. In Germany, people would kill for these scraps. Here they go into the trash because there's always more." The food wasn't just plentiful, it was diverse and exotic. The women tasted dishes they had never imagined. Hot dogs with mustard and relish, chili with beans and cheese, macaroni and cheese so creamy it seemed impossible, and jello, a wobbly, sweet dessert that defied explanation. Brigitte Werner wrote, "They served us something called jello, a red, jiggly substance that tastes like fruit. I thought it was a joke at first, but the Americans eat it like it's normal. Everything here is strange, wonderful, and overwhelming." For women raised on Nazi propaganda about American cultural inferiority, these meals were a revelation. The food wasn't just sustenance, it was a symbol of industrial might and agricultural abundance. The milk came from dairies producing millions of gallons annually. The beef came from stockyards processing thousands of cattle a day. The wheat for their bread came from Kansas fields harvested by combines that could reap 100 acres in a day. Under labor programs designed to address wartime shortages, many of the women were sent to work in fields, orchards, and factories, earning credits for their labor. These assignments offered an intimate glimpse into the machinery behind America's abundance. In Arkansas, Else Braun worked in a cannery processing tomatoes, green beans, and peaches. She watched in awe as conveyor belts moved thousands of cans per hour, each filled with produce destined for American tables, Allied troops, or Lend-Lease shipments. "In Germany, we rationed every tin," she wrote. "Here, they produce so much they ship it across oceans to their allies." In California's Central Valley, women picked strawberries in fields that stretched to the horizon. They were stunned to see workers discard berries for minor blemishes, fruit that would have been treasured in Germany. Greta Hoffman, who worked in a packing facility, marveled at the refrigerated trucks that kept produce fresh for days. "They have machines for everything," she wrote. "Machines to harvest, machines to pack, machines to refrigerate. No wonder they have so much." The psychological impact of this abundance was profound. The women had been taught that Germany's sacrifice, the rationing, the hunger, the suffering was necessary to build a glorious future. Yet here was a nation feeding its enemies better than Germany fed its own people. The dissonance was unbearable. Marlene Kessler wrote in a letter, "Every meal is an argument against everything we believed. They don't need conquest to feed their people. Their farms, their factories, their machines produce enough for the world. We were lied to, and the proof is on our plates." The food became a gateway to broader revelations. Under the Geneva Convention, the US Army offered the women access to educational programs, including English classes, vocational training, and lectures on American history and government. At Camp Swift, the women read American magazines like Life and Ladies' Home Journal, which showed images of ordinary families, their homes filled with appliances, their tables laden with food. They watched newsreels that reported not only victories but also domestic debates and criticisms of the government, a level of openness unthinkable in Nazi Germany. They saw Hollywood films like Since You Went Away and Casablanca, stunned by a nation confident enough to show complex, flawed characters to its enemies. The women also interacted with American civilians, experiences that challenged their preconceptions. In Concordia, Kansas, a local women's club invited a group of prisoners to a church social. The women, nervous and uncertain, entered a hall decorated with streamers and filled with tables of food, sandwiches, salads, cakes, and cookies. American women, mothers and grandmothers, greeted them with smiles and broken German, offering plates and cups of punch. "They treated us like guests, not prisoners," Anna Schmidt recalled. One woman, her name was Dorothy, gave me a recipe for apple pie. She wrote it down in German and told me to make it for my children when I got home. I didn't know what to say. I just cried. These encounters, repeated across the country, humanized the prisoners and challenged their Nazi ideology. The Americans weren't the godless materialists they had been told to expect. They were kind, generous, and deeply religious. Their churches filled every Sunday, their homes adorned with crosses and Bibles. The turning point for many came during Christmas 1945, a moment that crystallized America's bewildering generosity. Across the internment camps, American communities sent thousands of Christmas packages to the German women, parcels filled with soap, stockings, handkerchiefs, chocolates, and handmade scarves. At Camp Swift, the women sat down to a Christmas feast: roast turkey with stuffing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, green beans, rolls, and pumpkin pie with whipped cream. Local churches sang carols in German, Stille Nacht, drifting through the barbed wire. Girl Scouts delivered handmade cards, some signed with messages like "Peace to you from Texas" and "God bless you this Christmas." Greta Hoffman, who hadn't celebrated Christmas with her daughters in 3 years, sat at the table and sobbed. "They gave us a feast," she wrote in her diary. "They gave us gifts, songs, kindness. We are their enemies, yet they treat us like family. I don't understand this country, but I know now that everything we were told was a lie." The Christmas gestures weren't limited to Texas. In Oklahoma, prisoners received boxes of homemade cookies baked by local women. In Arkansas, a group of women was invited to a nearby farm for dinner, where they shared a meal with an American family and played with the farmers' children. Else Braun wrote, "I sat at a table with an American mother and her 2 sons. She served me chicken and pie and asked about my family in Germany. She didn't judge me. She didn't hate me. She just wanted to know if I was okay. I didn't know such kindness existed." These acts, small in isolation but overwhelming in their consistency, shattered the Nazi myth of American weakness. The women began to see America not as a land of decadence, but as a society built on a radical idea that even enemies deserved dignity. By early 1946, as news of Germany's devastation filtered into the camps, the women faced a deeper reckoning. Letters from home described cities in ruins, families starving, children orphaned. Greta Hoffman received a letter from her sister. Her daughters were alive but surviving on rations of 800 calories a day, eating grass and dandelion soup. The contrast between their suffering and her daily abundance was unbearable. "I eat hamburgers and ice cream while my children starve," she wrote. "How can I live with this?" The guilt was compounded by newsreels shown in camp theaters, footage of liberated concentration camps, emaciated survivors, mass graves, and the machinery of genocide. For many women, these images were a brutal confrontation with the moral bankruptcy of the regime they had served. Brigitte Werner wrote in her diary, "We laughed at American food, at their hamburgers and ice cream, thinking it was propaganda. But they fed us while our leaders let millions die in camps. We were the monsters, not them." The abundance of American food became a symbol of a broader truth. A free society built on innovation, cooperation, and trust could achieve what a totalitarian state could not. The women had tasted freedom in every bite, freedom from want, freedom to create, freedom to share. By 1946, as repatriation began, the women carried more than memories back to Germany. They brought lessons of a society that produced enough to feed its enemies with dignity, a society that valued openness over control and compassion over cruelty. Many became advocates for democracy in West Germany's reconstruction. Else Braun, who returned to Munich, became a teacher again, this time educating students about the dangers of totalitarianism and the power of democratic ideals. "The taste of American food stayed with me," she wrote in her memoirs. "Not just the flavor, but what it meant. A society that creates, not destroys." Others, like Greta Hoffman, applied the lessons they learned to rebuild their communities. Greta returned to Hamburg and worked with relief organizations, distributing food and supplies to starving families. She introduced American farming techniques she had witnessed, helping to increase crop yields and feed her devastated city. "I learned in America that abundance isn't a sin," she wrote. "It's a goal. A society that can feed everyone, even its enemies, is a society worth building." The statistics underscore the scale of this transformation. Of the 487 German women held in American camps, surveys conducted by the International Red Cross showed that 92% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Only 3 attempted escape, and all were quickly recaptured, not because of harsh punishment, but because they realized they had nowhere better to go. Post-war surveys revealed that 78% of former female prisoners believed their captivity had changed their worldview, with 67% expressing interest in democratic ideals. Hundreds maintained correspondence with American families who had sent them Christmas packages or invited them to their homes. In the 1950s, dozens of former prisoners immigrated to the United States, drawn by the promise of the abundance they had witnessed. In 1982, at a reunion in Austin, Texas, Greta Hoffman, now a grandmother living in New Jersey, stood before a crowd of Americans and Germans, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "We mocked your food, your hamburgers, your ice cream, your endless generosity," she said. "But every bite taught us something about your country, your strength, your humanity, your freedom. We came as enemies, but we left as students of a better world." The room erupted in applause. Among the audience were former guards, local women who had sent Christmas packages, and Girl Scouts now grown who had delivered cards to the prisoners 4 decades earlier. The German women who tasted American food didn't just eat. They were fed a new perspective. Their journey from despair to hope proved that America's greatest weapon was its ability to create, to share, and to transform. In the simple act of serving a meal, scrambled eggs, fried chicken, fresh milk, apple pie, America showed what a free society could achieve, turning enemies into allies and planting the seeds for a democratic Germany. The food they wept over became the flavor of a new world, a world where abundance and humanity could triumph over hatred and scarcity. As Greta Hoffman wrote in her final letter to the American family who had hosted her at Christmas, 1945, "You fed me when I was your enemy. You showed me kindness when I deserved none. You gave me hope when I had lost everything. I will never forget the taste of your apple pie. But more than that, I will never forget what it represented. A nation that believes even the broken can be healed, even the lost can be found, even enemies can become friends. Thank you for teaching me that freedom tastes like hope.